So yeah, in today's meeting didn't really work out, so I'm just uploading a video for today. We're gonna try to make our first basically screen for our application where they can design, where the user can design a form and save it. Um, and we are using MongoDB as our database. You can go to the MongoDB Atlas page and they'll give you basically a free cluster for your application for this project. I'm not going to go through that process though. Alright, so yeah, basically where we left off with last time was we just created our app.js file. I'm not going to go through writing all the code this time because I think we won't be able to finish that in our time limit, but I'll just do kind of more of like a code walkthrough, and if we have some time then maybe I'll add some functionality to the application at the end. Basically the first thing we want to do is from our Node.js backend, we want to connect to our database. So for that, I've created a folder named common, then I added a subfolder named services, and then we created this file called mongoose.service.js. And this is where we'll initialize our database connection. So in Mongoose, this is line 1, we're basically loading their Mongoose library. And here we're loading the .env package. So this is really important. Basically, it helps us encrypt our database details, make sure that we don't put the username, password, some of the other database connection details anywhere. And that's very important. Yeah, you don't want to upload your credentials to GitHub. All right, so continuing. So what we're doing here is we're defining some of the basic database connection options that we want to use for our MongoDB connection. And then over here, we've created the connection string, and then we're loading our username, password, the database DNS, and database, whatever database we're going to create inside the cluster. And then I've saved all that in an env file, which is also ignored in our git ignore. So make sure that we don't upload that file to GitHub. All right. In the env file, the format is like for each line you create the variable, environment variable you want, and equals, and then the value. So yeah, we've done that. And then what this is another way of defining function if we have not gone over that yet. And this connect with retry function, it'll try to connect until 5. It'll try to connect. And every time it fails, it'll try to retry after 5 seconds. And then that's why we have a connect with retry here. Yeah. So it'll say then, and then try to connect. And then I'll set a timeout for 5 seconds, and I'll try to connect again. All right. So and then we're running our connect with retry function here. And then we're exporting this Mongoose object that we have created now. So the rest of our application can use our database connection. So yeah, that was the first thing we went through. And then so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create, first we need to create our pull table that we have defined here, right? And then we've decided on these are like the fields, the primary key, prompt, and options. And then we want to create some APIs to save and some APIs to get the results. So first thing we're going to do is we create a polls folder that'll represent all the APIs related to that table. and then we have a controllers folder, and we have a models folder. So models folder is where we'll put all the code related to creating the database table and modeling the data, basically. So we'll create it in a folder called polls.model.js. And first thing we do is we get our mongoose object that has the database connection that we created in this file mongoose.service.js. And then we're also loading this class from the mongoose library schema. So we're defining our poll schema. That's the first thing we're going to do. And like we said, we want a prompt, and we want options. So prompt is a string, and then options is an array of strings. And then what we're doing here is we're saying we're basically creating like an implicit field called ID, which we will not specify. It'll get generated automatically, kind of like a in other database systems, kind of like a sequence that you assign to your table. So this is that type of functionality. It's giving it like a virtual ID, and what that does is it generates a ID and saves it to this field. Yeah, and then we're also making sure that virtual ID field is also saved to JSON. So we're doing that here, and so we're going to create a couple APIs. So we're kind of defining the way that will work. The first API we'll go over is the create poll. So what that'll do is that'll take the poll data that we receive from JSON, that'll create a new poll object with that poll data, and then we'll save that to our MongoDB table. And this poll object we're making sure that it uses our poll schema. Yeah. And then, yeah, let's also load that up here. And then we'll create some other APIs. One, find by schema, or find by ID. And basically what this will do, it'll go to the polls table and do a lookup based on whatever ID we pass in. And then this is like a callback function that we can use. This is the same. This is the same way of doing the code also. Yeah. So yeah. So what this function will do is return the find by ID as a callback. So we also have a list API function, and what we're doing here is based on our page limit, it will like return like a paginated set of results for our poll table, and just return the entire table to us, so we can see whatever polls that we have saved. So yeah, we have three APIs. One to create and save, which is the one we'll be using today for the most part, and one to find by ID, and this is another way of creating that find by ID function. Okay. So yeah, we created the functions that our controller will use to interact with the database. So this is the code for the model. And then if we go here, the polls.controller, what this will do, the first thing this will do is it'll pull all the code from the model. So we have poll model, and this will be able to access, this poll model object will be able to access our methods from our poll model class. So the first function we're going to go over is the insert function, which we are going to use to save data to our database. Yeah. So the way this will work is we will pass a JSON string of the data that we want to insert into the poll table, and then it'll use the model object to create that, and it'll return, okay, this is the ID that was generated for that object. And this is the controller or route for the, this is the controller function for the list. And what this will do, it will use the poll.list function to list out all the items that are in our poll table. Yeah. So this is, first we've defined our limit, and we're saying if we don't pass a limit, then the default is 100. Or no, sorry. We're gonna, first what we're gonna try to do is we're gonna see if our request has a limit, and if the limit is less than 100, less than or equal to 100. If it is, then we'll parse that. Otherwise, our default will be 10. This is basically another way of doing an if-else statement in JavaScript. So yeah, we'll read our query, and then we'll return our results using the list function from the model. And then we have our get by ID, which will use our poll model.find by ID function. Okay. And then we'll go to the routes.config.js file. So this is the basically the way we'll do the routing. That'll say, okay, if you hit /polls, then we want to run the insert function. For a post request, if you do a get request on that, it'll hit the list function. And if you do polls, and then this is a way of saying like query parameters. If you pass in the poll ID, then it'll use that, and it'll use the, and in the get by ID function will bring back the data for that ID. And we can look at the get by ID. See, it'll say rec.params.pollID. It'll pull that value and use it in the find by ID function. So we have our basically the APIs that we're going to use for our polls table. So this is the one that does the routing. Then we have the and then we go to the controller. We'll define the different functions that we need to interact with our database, like insert, list, get by ID, and then we'll use the poll model object to write to the database or read from the database. And this is the model object will use Mongoose's functionality, that the framework that we have to use with Mongoose. To create the table and to retrieve like list for the retrieve data for the list function, and find by ID, different things like that. Okay, so yeah, so going here, we have 3 different APIs that we can use now. One to save an entry to our database, one to retrieve all the results, and one to retrieve a specific result. Okay. So now the next thing we have to do is we have to register these API endpoints basically. So we do that in our app.js function. So we had this before where we're loading the Express library, we're using Express. One thing that we've added now is we have to use body parser, and you'll install this in the same way, npm install body parser. What body parser does, it helps us read the JSON requests that we get in our request body. So to register our routes, what we'll do is we'll read the file for our routes.config that we have defined here, and we'll say, okay, pull router is equal to that file, requires that file. And this line, what that is doing is it enables us to load our static JavaScript code that React will generate. And what we're doing here is we're setting certain header details. Basically this will help us with CORS issues, and we're saying, okay, allow us to allow all these different header methods, right? Okay. So that is basically allowing us to take in the requests. And then we've defined our, basically backup route. What will happen if the routing doesn't go through correctly? Our base route will return hello world. And then over here we register the body parser middleware, and basically this will make sure the requests will be converted to JSON correctly. And then this is the line where we're registering our routes that we have defined here. So this is saying, okay, register the /polls route for post request, /polls route for get request, and /poll/poll ID. Okay. And then over here we're saying, okay, listen to port 3000, and then process.env.port. So this is also like another important part. Make sure you're reading in this port variable with capitalized, because Heroku will not use the 3000 port. It'll decide like a random port to assign to our application. So we need to make sure we can accept that port. So yeah, now our application is running. So we'll go to where it is. We've deployed it through Heroku already. I've shown that before. So we have our application deployed here. Well, first we'll look at okay, we did /list, and that says, well, okay, it doesn't work because that's not what the route we've defined. The route we've defined is /polls. And then we can see I've already inserted some test data, and we can see some of the results that are in our poll table. And then a tool that I really like to use is Postman, that helps us with testing APIs and making sure that everything is working correctly, rather than through the entire UI. You can use this to just test our specific API endpoint. So let me show an example of that also. So yeah, we can run our application. So this is the way we have been running our application locally. So let's start our application locally. So our application now is running locally. So we can go to localhost 3000 polls. All right, and then we see, okay, these are the results. So getting data from our polls table is working correctly. and then let's say we want to enter a sample poll. What is your favorite food is our prompt string, and then for options we have an array of strings like say pizza, pani puri, pav bhaji, and then as we can see from the code, it returns our ID that was generated using that virtual field, right? And we can see if we go back to the models, we go to the create poll. That's what it's doing. We send in the JSON data, it read that correctly, and it created that poll object and saved it to our table. And then one thing that's very, very important is making sure that we have this body parser.json that'll take our request body and format it in the correct way for our application to use. And then we can go to the controller. So what happens, this is the first endpoint that, we'll go here. So this registers our route. So then we go to routes.config.js. So when we do a post call, it'll first come to this point, and it'll say /polls, and then we'll go to polls controller.insert. So we go to our insert function in polls controller. It'll load the poll model object, and it'll call the create poll method with our request body, and then it'll return the ID that was generated. And so yeah, and then as we saw, this is the function. All right, so our list API is working and our save API is working. I think now we're ready to create some UI components. So the way I've initialized our React application is create React app. This is one of the best ways to start creating our application, our React application. So what we did was in the base folder, we do create React app and we name it UI. But I've already created that, so I won't go through that process of loading everything again. And then we'll go into the UI folder now. So we'll create React app. We'll create a new package.json. You can see these are all the dependencies. We're going to be using a library called Materials UI and Materials UI icons for our UI components. I can show you that too. This is a popular React framework that uses material design. Yeah, and then you can go here and you can look at the components. Example, one of the ones that'll help us is let's go to like text field. So this gives us a library of React components that we can use, and so text field basically is an example, and it'll basically give us these types of fields that we can use in our React code. So yeah, we have to do again npm install add material UI. And then same thing for material UI icons. But yeah, that'll take a long time, so I'm not going to install that right now. So yeah, we'll go back to so if we go to the getting installation example, npm install at material UI core, and if we want to install the icons, we'll do at material UI /icons. Okay, so for the UI page, our entry point is we have this public folder, we have the source folder, and our entry point is app.js. Okay, so this is when we bring up our React application. This is the first screen that gets hit. So I'll show you how to run our React application. So go into the UI folder, and then we use, for create React strips, we're using Yarn as our package manager. So we'll do yarn start. And that will bring up our application. Yeah, so yep, it's still loading, so we'll wait for it. Okay, starting. And a really good feature of Yarn and the way the Create React Strips has been set up is it's like a hot reload. So any changes you make will automatically be reflected in the local development environment. So React basically uses this concept called JSX, and JSX lets us define React components and return that HTML. So when we define form component like this, form control is a React component, and React in its engine basically will convert all this to the exact HTML that is going to be rendered, and it allows us to modularize our code and focus on and reuse it basically. Okay, so we can see our code is deployed locally. So the first thing we have is we have this main div called app. That's the starting tag and the closing tag here. And then it's using a class called app. If we go to app.css, we can see some of the basic CSS that we have been given when we run create React app, and we're importing that right here. So yeah, so going through the imports, first thing we're going to do is we're going to import the React, basically our React framework, and then we're going to be using buttons. So we're going to import all the UI components that we need from Material UI. So buttons, text fields, form control, form label, form group, grid, and then we're also going to use one icon called radio button unchecked icon. Alright, so we'll define our form. So we have to do, the first component is form control, which we'll start there and close here. The second one we're going to do is form label. And this is basically the component we're going to use to let the user enter basically the question or the prompt that they want their form or their poll to ask. So we have imported form control from Material UI right there, and what we're going to do is we're going to use a text field to allow the user to enter some question that they want answered. So to control this text field, we're going to use React state. So that is also another feature of React that is really, really amazing. You can handle some state on the single page application. It'll store it internally. So for that, we're going to define a variable called question, and then we're going to define a function called handle prompt change to basically deal with the state and update the state correctly. So if we go to the top, we've defined this here, const question and set question, and then this is like a React hook called that we're going to use, and then it's called react.useState question, and this is the basically name of our state variable. Yeah, well, it's better not to have question marks in our variable name, so we'll do, yeah, just question like that as our variable name. And then, so this is the variable that will store the state information. This is the function that will update it. So we created handle prompt change. So whenever the user enters things into the text field and updates, this function is called handle prompt change. So it'll receive the event and it'll say, okay, whatever the user has entered, so event.target.value, we'll update the state accordingly. So set question function will update the question variable, and internally our state variable is called question that React is using. So this is a React hook, and that's kind of a relatively new feature in React, but it allows us to use React state very easily. So that we have defined there, our form label, our question. And then we'll go through this part of the code. So what is happening here? Over here, we are defining our form group. So that is what you see here, where they can answer basically, the user can enter options for a poll, and we can add and remove options. Okay. So first thing we're doing is we're just creating a div to hold all the different options. We're adding some padding that is to kind of put some space between the question and the options. And this is a way of defining some CSS for that div. So you can do this style and then pass in some CSS that you want. Over here, basically we're looping through a variable. So we have also used declared another state variable called value. So we can go up here. So we did yeah, we did value and set value. And what we're doing is React use state. Oh, sorry, I think I misspoke about this. When we do React.useState, and what we're passing in here is the starting default value. So this is not the variable name. This is the starting default value that our variable use. Our variable name is question. And that is what React is using in the state. So same thing we're doing here. We're doing a React use state, and we're passing the initial default value, which is a list of one element and of strings, and the first element basically, or the only element, is a string called sample. That's why you'll see sample as the default value there. So same process. We're creating a variable called value, and we're creating a function called setValue to update that. Okay. So yeah, what we're doing is we'll read through the the strings in the value list, basically. And now we're going to create basically text fields that allow the user to basically edit the options. This is another concept called grid. So React or Material UI gives us this component called grid to be able to easily organize, the data that we want, and this gives us like a grid layout. So we can go and see that. We go here, components, grid. So this is basically what grid allows us to do. It allows us to organize our data, our components, using this grid format, and we can basically create this type of structure. Alright, so what we're doing here is we're creating two items in our grid. The first item is basically I think I'm saying basically way too many times, so I'm going to try to use a different word. So what we have here is an icon, a radio button unchecked icon, which we've imported right here. And what that is this image, this icon image, that'll kind of indicate to the user that this will be a radio list that they're creating the form, they're creating in our poll. And then the next item we'll put in our grid is the text item, the text field, and that is where they'll update the option. And what we want to happen is when they edit the data in this text field, it'll update the appropriate string in our list, and the value is basically using basically again. Value is our array of strings. So when we update, we want to update at the correct index. That's why we're passing index here. So we have our function handle change of index. Alright, so we see here, we pass in the index as a parameter, and we're also getting the event. And then this is where we'll write our code. So another important thing is whenever we're updating state, we have to assign a new value. We cannot just, that variable, we cannot just modify it. We need to assign a new value to that state variable. And that is basically, that is the concept of Redux, and I can show you about that too. Let me see. Alright, this is not the right React state. I'm looking for the correct diagram I want to show. Okay. So this is explaining React state. And what happens is whenever you update the state variable, React holds that state internally, and what we're doing is we want to say, okay, the old, whenever an event comes in, we want to say that, okay, get rid of the old state that we're using and start and update our state with this new value. Handling events. Okay. So that is, we're following that same process. I can't find the diagram I want to show, but okay. All right. So yeah, that's kind of what we're doing with our React state. Yeah. So, but yeah, this line is very important, and it's basically it's doing a deep copy instead of a shallow copy. Because if we do a shallow copy, we're really just updating that original variable data. We're not creating a new instance of it. So yeah, and we want to make sure we update the right element in our list. So that's why we're using that index parameter. And then yeah, that's what we're doing in our handle change. We're updating the right list or list option. Okay, then we'll move on to our code. Then at the bottom, what we're doing is we created a new grid again, and we're going to add three buttons. One is for add, one is for remove, and one is for saving our data. Okay. So we'll go to the first button that we've added. That's called add, and then we created a on-click handler called handle add click. So we have this here, handle add click. Same thing we're doing. We're making sure we do a deep copy, create a new instance of that variable, and then we're pushing an extra, a variable to the list. We're pushing an extra string to the list, and we're putting the default sample there. And now our list has one more element. And same way for the remove button, we have handle remove click. And what that will do is we do a deep copy of our list, and we do pop to get rid of the last element. And then we have our save button. This is the most important part. This is where we'll interact with our API. So yeah, this is another part. You should put the string of where your application is deployed. So we have that there, and we have our API endpoint, our route, which is /polls. We're making sure it's a post application, and we're adding the correct header, application JSON, and then we're creating our JSON string with the prompt data, which is our question variable from our state, and our value data, which is that list of string of basically options that we want in our poll.